Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 598 for the 24th of Tammuz in a regular year. So if you've been following along the podcast lately, then you most probably have noticed that the topic du jour is addiction. And really understanding how this concept of addiction doesn't really apply only to severe addicts. That's maybe a caricature that can help us understand this topic in a very pronounced way. But really, it applies to all of us because all of us on some level have these things within us, these compulsions that lead us to do things sometimes, unfortunately, that are out of line with ourselves, that are out of sync with our highest self, that are out of sync with our Creator, who is the source of vitality of our life. And this is why it's explained in Jewish literature. It talks about this idea that anytime a person does a sin, it's only because a spirit of folly enters into them, because it's not a sane thing to do. Because if to live out of sync with the source of your life does not make any sense. We want to live a full life. We want to live optimally and in line with who we are. Like, who would want to do something that's not who they really are? It doesn't make any sense. And it really is only because of some kind of spirit of folly that enters into us, that leads us to do things, just like an addict, to be compelled to do things that addicts don't want to be engaged in their addiction. They're not happy being an addict. They're not like happy destroying their families, giving up their jobs and living on the street sometimes, like these kind of things. It's not like those things are bringing them joy or it's something that is enjoyable to them. It's a compulsion of some kind. And we all fall victim to this in some way or another when we are doing things that are out of line with our Creator. So we've been discussing this whole topic, and we've been discussing the idea of how it is that people fall into these addictions, quote unquote, which in the Tanya terms are transgressions. And we've also been talking about how to heal from it, how to return, how to do Teshuva in the language of Kabbalah, of Chassidus, of Judaism at large. We've discussed how even the word Teshuva itself points to this idea of returning to our source. When we break it down etymologically, it's tashuv hey, return the hey. So we looked at this tetragrammaton, we looked at the four-letter name of God and how it's made up of the letters yud and hey and vav and hey, and how when we do tshuva, we're returning that hey, the lower hey, to a source, to the vav from which it fell. Interestingly, if you look at the tetragrammaton, there's actually two hays, right? There's the higher hay and the lower hay, and that's not by accident. So each one of those hays does involve tshuva, but just on a different level. And this is what we're going to be talking about today, that there's actually a lower type of tshuva and a higher type of tshuva. And we're going to talk about how the baseline for the higher tshuva is achieving that lower tshuva. So what does this mean? Lower tshuva, higher tshuva, returning to self on some level, returning to self on another level. So what the basic idea, as we'll learn, is that lower tshuva, basic lower tshuva, which we've talked about somewhat extensively so far about what's involved in doing that, and in terms of first arousing compassion for yourself, for your godly soul, as well as your godly source, and also coming to a sense of brokenness, coming to a sense of humility, and coming to a sense of sobriety, really recognizing who you are for real and what you've been doing and how out of sync these transgressions are from your true self. All of that, this accounting of the soul as we talk about it, these are all the things that prepare a person to really engage in this lower form of tshuva, that really prompt a person to be able to then arouse this mercy on high, which will in turn lead them to be able to return to their source. So to return that hey back to that state of equilibrium, back to the vav. So that's like the baseline. That's the level of tshuva. Tshuva, you've returned. You're back at your baseline. You're back where you started at originally. Great, you're good to go. Okay, now what is higher tshuva? Now this is where it gets even really deeper, and this is where, in my opinion, tshuva really can be thought of as, in a certain sense, being time travel. What do I mean by this? Higher tshuva is where we can actually bring ourselves to such a state that we don't just reach that equilibrium point where we restore ourselves back to where we were before. We actually are able to restore ourselves to that level, to a level within ourselves, in a place in which it's like before we even sinned, where we get to a state of actually restoring ourselves to a level that it's as if we never sinned. It's like we go before it all. What is this likened to in Tanya, as we'll learn about when we get into the text? It's likened to before the exhale. So if you recall, we spoke about this idea of breath. We had a whole episode about breath, and our breath being like a rope and everything like that, and how the thing that's unique about the human being, specifically the Jew, is that we were created through the breath of God directly, like in a direct exhale, like a or a blowing kind of way, as opposed to everything else in creation, which was created through Hashem's speech, which is also an exhale, but it's not as intense. It's not as internal. Like, it's not coming from as deep within the blower. When a person speaks, or when God speaks, so to speak, on a different level, it's coming from a more external place within the person that's speaking, or God who's speaking, versus the blower, somebody who blows. That blow, that breath, that exhale is coming from deep, deep, deep within the person on a new level. So now what about being able to go back to that place before the blow, before the exhale? That's where the exhale is really one with the blower themselves, one with the person, one with God, so to speak. So it's like there is no separation at all. And this is what we'll learn, is this idea of this higher level of tshuva, where it's not just about restoring equilibrium, but it's actually about going back to that place before the breath, before the exhale. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe outlines all of this, and maybe we'll discuss all of this a little bit more as we go.
And for context, we are still in the middle of chapter 8 today. We're going to conclude chapter 8 of Iggeres HaTeshuva. So as a recap from last time, we spoke about, if you recall, the idea of resetting the hay of the Yud Ke Vav Ke, which is kind of representative in our souls, back to its source. This is the idea of tshuva, tashuv hay, returning the hay. And we talked about how this is, how we can do this, how we can, through arousing the 13 attributes of Hashem's mercy. So now today, we're going to talk about how that, that level of tshuva that we spoke about yesterday, that's sort of like the baseline of tshuva. That's like what we know as tshuva tata, lower tshuva. But now there's a higher level of tshuva as well. There's a level of Teshuva Ila'ah, higher tshuva. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that
from here, once a person has got to this place where where the Spirit has passed over them and purified them, now they can really return to God in a true way, like truly to God himself. So what does this mean? This means that they can ascend to a great place, to a very high place into their source, and to cleave to God with an amazing unity. As they were connected to God with utmost unity before God even blew the breath into him. So before they were created, kind of thing, So it's like we spoke about this idea about how intimate it is that Hashem creates man through breath, and how it's like we're all walking around and we have this breath of God within us. But what if we were able to return to God and connect with God on a level that's like pre-breath, that's before the exhale, and before this breath came down to be enclosed in the body of man? And so now in brackets, the Alter Rebbe gives us like a visual for this. He says this is like, by way of analogy, really, if we think about a person, before a person exhales, the exhale is one with them. So like, think about it. It's like, maybe we'll do a little exercise here. Like, think about, like, you're going to breathe now, but before you breathe, just imagine that you're about to breathe, and then you take an exhale like that. So where was that exhale before you breathed it out into the world, before you made the sound? It was within you. It was one with you. So that's the level at which a person can return to now on this level. And this is the full return, the full tshuva. And this aspect of unity and this aspect of tshuva is what we call Teshuva Ila'ah, the higher tshuva, which comes after lower tshuva. As is written in the Holy Zohar, in the Ram Nehemna, and Parshas Naso, that this supernal tshuva, this Teshuva Ila'ah, is, what is it? It's when a person engages in the study of Torah out of love and fear. So why specifically Torah study? Like, what does that have to do with higher tshuva? So basically, the Alter Rebbe goes back and he talks again about, or really it's the Zohar that does this, speaks again about the Tetragrammaton. So okay, we've restored this hey, the lower hey, to its source. The letter that comes before the hey is the vav, and this vav is the progeny. It's the offspring of the two letters before it, the yud and the hey, which the yud and the hey correspond to bina, correspond to understanding, contemplation. So this is why we can understand that, like, basically this higher level of tshuva, like if we want to go beyond that lower hey and want to actually connect to the vav that's above that, that comes about through Torah study, because that is connected to bina, which is the yud and the hey, which give birth to the vav. And now the Alter Rebbe concludes with a brackets in which he explains that this is, that if we want to talk about the advantage, the superiority of Balei Teshuva over tzaddikim, total tzaddikim in this aspect, is that which it says in Parshas Chayei Sarah, that they draw, and this is from just give you the source, it's from the Zohar, for the first part of the Zohar, page 129b, and where it says they draw upon themselves with a more intense longing of the heart and with greater forcefulness to approach the king. So it's a little obscure, but the basic idea is that basically, if you can understand somebody who like had to do tshuva, somebody who went through this whole process of having to engage in this compassion for themselves, breaking their heart, and only then they come to that level of like equilibrium, and now they work really hard to learn Torah with love and fear. This intensity through which they study Torah and engage in this Torah study is most likely going to be a lot more intense, a lot more passionate than somebody who didn't have to go through that whole journey. That's the basic idea. So that's the end of the section for today. So just to briefly recap, what we learned about is how basically everything we spoke about in the previous episodes about basically coming to terms with transgression, coming to terms with the fact that transgression basically is doing something that's out of line with your true self. It's not what your godly soul wants to do. And not only is it not what your godly soul and God himself want you to do, doing transgressions unfortunately drags the godly soul and drags God down into the dirt with us, with the sin. And so when we come to that awareness, this will lead to a sense of sobriety, and this will encompass both feelings of compassion and feeling of breaking our heart, like humility, great humility. And these two things will serve as a prerequisite to really be able to arouse compassion on high and to cause God's attributes of mercy, the 13 attributes of mercy, to redeem a person and to cleanse a person. And today we spoke about the idea of how this is possible because the 13 attributes of mercy are sourced in the part that's like right above the Tetragrammaton. It's like the source, the little protrusion on the yud. So it surpasses the regular spheres. It actually comes from Hashem's ratzon. So that's why they have the power to cleanse a person. And after that initial stage of cleansing, which we can think of as lower tshuva, then we spoke about this idea that then a person can actually come to this even higher level of tshuva where they really connect with God himself in this like pre-breath kind of way, in this way of before the exhale, before God blew into our soul. So it's like really connecting to our source in a truly deep way. And we spoke about that the way that after going through this whole process of sobriety and then subsequent coming back to equilibrium, becoming clean, so to speak, then you can actually reach even higher than that. And you can come to a place as like of before that, back to your source completely. So maybe if we wanted to go back and think about an addict, we can think about, okay, maybe step one, which is a very big step, and it's not something to be minimized, is becoming clean and being totally clean, not having that addiction, not being a slave to the addiction anymore, where you can really say that like it doesn't have a hold on you anymore. But then there's this higher level where you can actually get to this place that's like before that you actually are connecting with yourself and living in such a way as before the addiction even had a hold on you at all. So that's a much deeper level. So that's it for today, and tomorrow we will begin we're actually going to do the entirety of chapter 9. So I'll speak to you then.
Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.